I've flown hundreds of times for work, for family, for vacations, and not once did I ever fear the sky. Until that night. It was February 18th. My company had just wrapped a 3-day medical equipment expo in Denver. I was exhausted, mentally more than physically, and all I wanted was to get home to my wife and kids in Seattle. The flight was scheduled for 8:45 p.m. Alaska Airlines 237. Routine. Familiar. Safe. I boarded with my noise-cancelling headphones, ready to fall asleep before we even took off. But something felt off. You know how airports are loud and chaotic? Not that night. The gate area had this eerie hush, the kind you feel in a hospital waiting room, not a boarding gate. No one talked much. People smiled tight smiles, and the gate agent's voice cracked while making the final call. I remember thinking she looked like she was trying not to cry. I had an aisle seat, 16D. The window seat next to me remained empty until a tall man with a grey overcoat and leather gloves silently slipped into 16C. He didn't make eye contact. No carry-on, no phone, no visible luggage. He just sat stiffly and stared straight ahead. A few minutes after takeoff, I tried to make small talk. Habit, I guess. But he didn't even blink. His jaw was locked tight, and his breathing was so shallow I almost couldn't see his chest move. I gave up and leaned back, half annoyed, half unnerved. About 20 minutes into the flight, we hit the first wave of turbulence. Nothing unusual, just a few bumps. But then it didn't stop. The plane began to sway side to side, not just up and down. A long, guttural creak echoed through the fuselage like the aircraft was groaning. People looked around, confused, concerned. That's when 16C whispered something under his breath. He said, "It's happening again." I turned sharply. "What?" He didn't answer. He just clutched the armrests, his gloved fingers twitching as the lights in the cabin dimmed for a second, then flickered back. A baby started crying a few rows ahead. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm but clearly strained. He explained we were entering a weather front earlier than expected. "Mild turbulence," he said. "Fasten seatbelts." Bull. I've flown through storms. This wasn't mild. The overhead bins began to rattle violently. Somewhere behind me, something fell with a metallic clang. People gasped, cursed. The woman across from me crossed herself. Then the plane dipped, fast. That sudden drop, the kind that forces a scream out of your throat before you realize you're doing it. But we didn't stop falling. We just kept dropping. The pressure in the cabin shifted so hard my ears popped painfully. Oxygen masks didn't drop. Instead, the ceiling panels above the center aisle shuddered like they were going to rip open. The lights cut out for a full 5 seconds. Total darkness except for flashes of lightning outside, illuminating terrified faces. The turbulence wasn't just physical anymore. The plane was shaking in ways that didn't make sense, diagonally, spiraling, the kind of motion that should tear a jet apart. I heard passengers screaming prayers in multiple languages, and that man in 16C, he began to chant. Not loud, not frantic, quiet and rhythmic, in a language I'd never heard before. He wasn't looking outside or even at me, just muttering that horrible mantra with his eyes shut and lips trembling. Then we stopped, not landed, not steady, just stopped. The turbulence ceased completely. It was like someone hit pause. For the first time, I noticed there was no engine noise. None. Just silence. Unnatural, suffocating silence. A few passengers unbuckled and stood, looking toward the windows. The guy ahead of me leaned over to look outside and immediately screamed. I mean, full-body, blood-curdling horror. I craned to look too. We weren't in the sky anymore. At least, not our sky. There were stars, millions, in unnatural patterns, but no moon, no clouds, no earth. Just a vast black void surrounding us, like we had pierced through reality. Below us, or maybe above, there was no real sense of direction. Was a red, rippling glow, like magma seen from miles away. The pilot never came over the intercom again. Some brave soul ran toward the cockpit, screaming for answers. He never came back. I saw his body tumble back down the aisle 5 minutes later, burned, smouldering, and stiff like a mannequin. We were not flying anymore. We were somewhere else. Some people broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. One man tried to open the emergency exit, but it wouldn't budge. The windows began to darken, like something on the outside was spreading over them. And that man next to me, 16C, he finally turned his head and looked straight at me. "You never should have boarded this flight," he said. "Not this one, not flight 237. Then the descent began. Not like a plane landing, more like being pulled. The cabin tilted violently forward. Passengers slammed against their seatbelts, trays snapped off. The lights exploded in a shower of sparks. People screamed until they lost their voices. And through it all, 16C kept whispering, "It's feeding, it's feeding. The lost must be taken." I blacked out. When I woke up, the plane was still, perfectly still, not a sound. But we hadn't landed. We were sitting in the middle of what looked like a barren field of ash. The sky above was black with a deep crimson hue at the horizon. Nothing moved outside. No wind, no wildlife, no signs of Earth. The cabin was filled with a faint electrical hum, like a heartbeat. Seats were empty. Everyone was gone. No bodies, no luggage, just me and 16C. He stood slowly, removed his gloves, and finally smiled. "Now you understand," he said. "You'll be staying." Then he turned, walked toward the front of the plane, and vanished through the locked cockpit door without opening it. I ran up and down the aisle, opening the lavatories, checking under seats, pounding on the cockpit door. No one, no trace. Not even a whisper of life. But then I found something that hadn't been there before. On each seat, a name tag. A blackened piece of metal etched with names. And not the names of the passengers I remembered. These were different names. Old names. Outdated fonts. Names like Margaret B. 1957 or Captain E. Thorne 1974. One read, J. Halverson, last seen 2002. I checked mine. It had my name, and underneath it, in tiny scorched letters, claimed. Suddenly the engines roared to life. I fell backward as the plane violently surged upward, the hum growing louder and louder. The windows were now pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. A voice crackled over the intercom. Not the captain. It sounded like hundreds of voices layered together, whispering the same phrase in perfect unison. Next flight departing. Next flight returning. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this flight would never end. It would rise and fall, again and again, claiming whoever boarded. A purgatory in motion. A sky with no ceiling. A descent with no bottom. And I I was part of the crew now. It was supposed to be a routine flight. Flight 298 from Denver to Seattle, a route so familiar to Captain Ron Barrett that he could almost land it with his eyes closed. He'd been flying commercial jets for over 20 years, and turbulence had long since lost its power to unnerve him. But that Tuesday afternoon, as the plane cruised over the Rocky Mountains, there was something different. An atmosphere, a pressure, almost like the sky was waiting. Passengers were settling in. Overhead bins were clicked shut. The air hostesses moved with mechanical efficiency. In seat 14A, Martin Keller, a 52-year-old architect returning from a business trip, glanced out the window. The clouds looked oddly still, almost like they weren't clouds at all, more like smoke frozen in place. He frowned, trying to shake the eerie feeling. 20 minutes into the flight, the plane began to shake. Nothing unusual, just mild bumps that most passengers ignored. But within seconds, the seatbelt sign dinged on again. The voice of Captain Barrett came over the speakers, calm but clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Martin fastened his belt, but his eyes remained glued to the window. The clouds were thickening unnaturally. They weren't moving with the plane. It felt like the plane had entered something solid. The jolt that came next knocked a beverage cart sideways and caused a baby 2 rows down to start screaming. That's when things began to truly spiral. The lights flickered, then the plane dropped, hard. A collective scream tore through the cabin. Coffee flew into the air, and passengers grabbed armrests like lifelines. A young woman in 22C shouted, "This isn't normal. It's not supposed to feel like this." Captain Barrett's voice crackled through again, but this time it sounded different, strained. "We're descending briefly to avoid, this weather pattern. Remain calm." The plane leveled out briefly, only to drop again, sharper, longer. It was as if gravity had hiccuped. Panic began to spread, not just among the passengers, but among the crew as well. Flight attendant Dana Lewis was trying to comfort a child while keeping herself upright. She'd flown through storms before, but this wasn't weather. She whispered to her colleague, "It's like something's pulling us down." Meanwhile, Martin noticed something in the cloud cover outside. Something impossible. Shapes, figures, human-like, but elongated, twisting unnaturally. Their mouths were open, but they made no sound. They hovered just outside the window. Then, just as quickly, they vanished. Martin blinked hard, unsure whether to trust his eyes. The third drop came like a trapdoor opening beneath them. People screamed louder than before. This wasn't ordinary turbulence. It felt orchestrated, deliberate. Someone or something was doing this. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The lights dimmed again. Dana tried to call the cockpit, but there was no response. When she reached the door, it was locked, and she swore she heard a low murmur on the other side, a voice whispering something rhythmic and alien. Martin's seat neighbor, an elderly woman who'd said nothing the entire flight, turned to him with a pale face. "It always happens on the third drop," she whispered. "That's when they decide." He stared at her. Who decides?" She didn't answer. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she slumped in her seat. Martin yelled for help, but the screaming and chaos drowned out everything. The plane was no longer descending in a straight line. It was circling, descending, almost spiraling down into something unseen below. Captain Barrett's final message wasn't broadcast. It came through the intercom as a whisper. Don't look outside. Don't look at their faces. They know when you see them. Too late. Half the passengers were now staring, horrified, through their windows. The shapes were back. Dozens of them. They looked like passengers. Former passengers. Still wearing the uniforms of past decades. Faces frozen in screams. Eyes pitch black. The plane never reached Seattle. Official records claim Flight 298 lost radar contact and disappeared off the grid. No wreckage was ever found. No emergency beacon. Just gone. Martin's wife received a voicemail from his phone later that night. All it contained was static and one whispered word: drop. What no one knew was that the plane did land, just not here. Dana, or what was left of her, awoke strapped in her seat inside a darkened fuselage. The windows were now completely black, and something was knocking from outside. Not like metal against metal, no. It sounded like bone. A slow, patient tap, 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 moving down the length of the fuselage. She screamed for help, but the sound was swallowed by the thick silence around her. Then a low, groaning sound came from the floor beneath her, like something crawling under the plane, something alive. The lights blinked once more and revealed the passengers still seated, but now each one of them was turned, staring directly at her, eyes black as void. Martin was still conscious, but only barely. He sat in a field of fog. The plane's remains were scattered around him in geometries that made no sense. The sky above wasn't the sky. It was moving, breathing, pulsing, and within the mist, figures walked toward him, tall, thin, with faces that shifted like melting wax. He tried to stand, but his legs were leaden. One of the figures leaned in close, and Martin finally saw its eyes. There were none, just deep tunnels that pulled at his sanity. It whispered, not in words, but in memories. His childhood fears, his mother's final breath, the night terrors he thought long gone. It fed on them. It was supposed to be a routine business trip from Denver to Seattle. Jonathan Harris, 47, an experienced consultant with over 2 decades of travel under his belt, was used to the cramped seats, stale coffee, and the dull hum of jet engines. Nothing about flying surprised him anymore, or so he thought, as he sipped his overpriced airport cappuccino at gate B22. The overhead speaker crackled to life. Flight 107 to Seattle is now boarding all passengers. He glanced at the window. Clouds were thick, cotton-like masses rolling in with a brewing storm behind them. The weather was turning, but there was no delay announced. With a sigh, Jonathan gathered his briefcase and joined the line. He'd flown in worse. Still, something tugged at him, an unease he couldn't place. The aircraft was a standard Boeing 737, familiar and unimpressive. Jonathan settled into his seat. Team B, next to a window occupied by a woman who barely looked up as he sat. She had earbuds in, eyes closed, lips moving silently like she was reciting a prayer. Odd, he thought, but not his business. Across the aisle, a father tried calming his nervous teenage son. The boy looked pale, gripping the armrests like they were lifelines. As the plane taxied and took off, the usual sensations followed: the slight jerk, the shift in gravity, the ascending hum. Jonathan flipped open his tablet, diving into a report. It wasn't until the plane pierced a dense cloud bank that the first jolt hit. It started as a shudder, mild enough to be mistaken for a speed bump in the sky. Jonathan barely reacted, but then the plane dipped. Not dramatically, just enough for stomachs to lurch and a ripple of nervous laughter to spread. Then came the voice over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some light turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Jonathan exchanged a look with the woman next to him. Her lips had stopped moving. Her hands were clenched on her thighs. She looked terrified. The turbulence grew worse. The cabin lights flickered. Trays clattered. The father across the aisle muttered something under his breath. Prayer or curse? Jonathan couldn't tell. The pilot's voice returned, more strained this time. "We've hit an unexpected weather pattern. Nothing to worry about, but we'll be adjusting altitude." Outside, lightning flashed, not just once or twice, but constantly, strobing the cabin in unnatural bursts. Jonathan felt it then, deep in his gut. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. The plane suddenly leveled. No shaking, no noise, just silence. Too much silence. Jonathan looked around. People sat tensely, eyes darting. The overhead lights had dimmed to an eerie low. The woman next to him was whispering now, still praying. Then came the sound, a low groan, metallic and distant, not from the engines, from below. Jonathan felt a vibration through his feet. Faint at first, then more defined. Like something scraping against the fuselage. The father across the aisle stood up despite the seatbelt light. "There's something down there," he said aloud. A flight attendant rushed over. "Sir, you need to..." But before she could finish, the plane lurched violently to the left. Screams erupted. Overhead bins flew open. A suitcase struck someone near the back. The woman beside Jonathan gripped his arm with unnatural strength. "They're not supposed to be awake," she whispered. Oxygen masks dropped with a hiss. Alarms blared. Jonathan could barely breathe. He shoved the mask over his face, trying to steady his hands. The plane was dropping. People screamed, cried, prayed. But amidst the chaos, Jonathan heard something else. A whisper, not through the intercom, in his ear, clear and cold. "You're not supposed to be here." As the descent slowed and the cabin steadied momentarily, a different kind of panic spread. The woman beside Jonathan held her phone, showing him something. It was a picture of a passenger manifest. Today's flight. Jonathan scanned it, confused. Then his eyes locked onto the names. His wasn't listed. Neither was the woman's. Neither was the boy's, or the father's. "We weren't supposed to board," she whispered. "They warned us in dreams." The aircraft emerged from the cloud bank. Seattle was visible below, but not right. Buildings were distorted, roads twisted at impossible angles. A black mist rolled across the skyline. The intercom crackled again. This time, it wasn't the pilot. A voice, ancient and dry. "Welcome. You've crossed into our sky." Jonathan's blood turned to ice. With a sudden jerk, the plane pulled back. Lightning again, screams again. But now, daylight, real clouds, real sound. The turbulence stopped. The pilot came back on, calm, normal. "Ladies and gentlemen, apologies for that rough patch. We'll be landing shortly." Jonathan looked around. The woman was gone. The boy and father, gone. No one else seemed to remember.